In late June 1945, the Allies have just defeated Nazi Germany, but British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was worried about Soviet control of Eastern Europe. Churchill feared that Stalin would lock in Poland and the rest of Central Europe into a Soviet sphere despite pledging not to at the Yalta Conference. The Red Army sat deep in Central Europe with a huge ground strength and intact momentum. Britain saw U.S. demobilization and worried that Western leverage would rapidly shrink once American armies redeployed to finish the Pacific War. Basically, the calculus was, if war was to happen with the Soviets, the Western Allies' best chance would be a preemptive strike right now. However, the British Chiefs of Staff realized this plan was insane and would probably result in Western Europe getting steamrolled. Plus, the War-Weary Republic would probably not sign on to yet another campaign, so the plan got binned. But what if Churchill's bottle spoke to him more strongly, so he just said F it, and the Americans just gave in to their base instincts for bombing shit? Let's look at a Western Allies victory scenario first. So basically, the Allies send an ultimatum to Moscow on June 12th, which demands free access for Allied commissions in Poland, withdrawal of NKVD units from occupied zones, and a schedule of elections across Central Europe. Stalin flat out refuses. On June 18th, Operation Unthinkable begins at dawn. In the north, the British Second Army and Canadian First Army cross the Elbe toward the Oder, supported by massive fighter sweeps from Denmark and Schleswig. In the center, the U.S. 9th and 1st Armies drive on Leipzig and Dresden to rupture Soviet rail links. In the south, the U.S. Third Army hits towards Prague to hold Soviet reserves in place. Most importantly, Allied air forces execute a round-the-clock rail interdiction campaign from Stettin to Krakow. The Allies also begin rearming German divisions to assist, which must be incredibly awkward when the former Wehrmacht soldiers have to fight along Polish XL units, who in turn push through Silesia, lighting a political fire inside Poland as whatever of the underground that wasn't nuked by the Germans rises up in several cities. Despite being numerically superior, Soviet forward armies reel under air attack and the loss of supplies. Baltic ports are blockaded, and the Red Air Force contests the skies but loses heavily. Trinity preparations continue in New Mexico, but Truman authorizes atomic use only if Soviet forces threaten a general breakthrough into the Allied rear or refuse talks after a decisive ground battle defeat. Neutral Swedish emissaries send this message on its way to Moscow. By mid-July, British and Canadian formations seize bridgeheads near Stettin and Kürsten, with U.S. forces also cutting off the Dresden rail hub. Soviet counterattacks under Zhukov are fierce, but bleed out under Allied jab and move tactics, and interdiction of bridges over the Vistula and Oder. Back in New Mexico, Trinity's test succeeds, and Stalin dismisses reports, but also orders industry east of the Dnieper dispersed. The Allies launch Operation Vistula Net at the end of July. Airborne and armored thrusts sever Warsaw from Soviet supply, and the Soviet line bows back towards Lublin, and a Polish National Council forms inside the liberated districts of Warsaw, protected by Allied air umbrellas. With Japan still fighting, the United States collapses Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which prompts Japan to surrender and frees up American forces for Europe. The Soviets meanwhile counterattack from the Pripyat region. The largest tank battle since Kursk ends with heavy losses on both sides. But Allied artillery control and fighter bombers grind down Soviet armor. Sweden then begins to open quiet mediation channels. In October in Zurich, Truman, Churchill returned to office after a snap election framed around resisting Soviet domination, and de Gaulle issued a joint peace framework. Borders to be settled by plebiscite, Allied and Soviet withdrawals staged, and international commissions for Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states. Stalin refuses. So by November, the Allies execute Operation Iron Bridge, a winter rail grab from Lviv to Vilnius. Soviet forces retreat to a prepared line around the Dnieper. Partisan warfare explodes in Belarus and the Baltics, now openly supported by Allied special operations. By January of 1946, the United States deploys 2 more atomic bombs to Britain. A demonstration shot over the White Sea is conducted on February 15th. All the while, Soviet industry relocations and rail damage creates a fuel famine at the front. A spring Allied offensive breaks the Dnieper shoulder near Kiev. Odessa falls after a joint sea and air campaign that mines Soviet approaches and cuts the rail from Kharkiv. Turkey, reassured by Allied naval strength, closes the straits to Soviet warships. By spring, Soviet high command faces food and coal shortfalls and growing strikes in Ukraine and the Urals. Beria and Zhukov press Stalin to take the Zurich framework. The Allies published a detailed occupation and election timetable for Poland and Czechoslovakia to reassure European opinion. With Stalin refusing, he ends up getting cooed by Lavrentiy Beria, who agrees to the ceasefire with the Western Allies. The Armistice of Minsk entails a Soviet withdrawal from occupied Central and Eastern Europe. and participating in the Zurich Framework. 1947 sees a European Recovery Program, aka the Marshall Plan, enacted a year early and also expanding eastward, along with NATO being founded the same year to also include Eastern European countries. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, stuff is chaotic. A palace settlement removes Beria and shifts day-to-day control to a committee centered around Zhukov and Malenkov. The Red Army is ordered to demobilize, but the common form effectively dissolved. Additionally, plebiscites in the Baltic countries grant them their independence. With the Soviets thoroughly thrashed, they aren't able to support Mao Zedong and his communist movement in China, which means the Kuomintang wins the civil war. And in turn, means Mao can't help the communists in Korea. So the war there still erupts, but it's an easy UN victory. By 1952, the United States tests a thermonuclear device. Rather than ignite a new arms spiral, the Zurich II framework binds both blocs to a ceiling on strategic delivery systems and establishes reciprocal aerial inspections over each other's territories. By 1954, things have settled down for a formal peace settlement with the Soviets, where the USSR recognizes the sovereignty of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states. In exchange, Allied forces evacuate most of the forward bases east of the Oder and pledge no nuclear basing in Poland, while the USSR gets to retain Soviet republics like Ukraine and Belarus. The Suez Crisis still erupts, but the United States now has deeper leverage in Europe and quietly compels a ceasefire in a few days, with all sides agreeing to give the canal to the UN. Moscow also still launches Sputnik, but pairs it with an invitation to joint orbital scientific work through the International Geophysical Year. NASA still forms anyways, but the space race becomes less of a competition in this timeline, with both sides agreeing to a bit more cooperation. Cuba also still goes revolutionary, but without a Soviet shield, Washington and Havana reach a grudging modus vivendi after a failed Bay of Pigs equivalent is never attempted in this timeline. Cuba aligns more with nations like Yugoslavia and Indonesia, but continues to trade sugar to both the United States and the Soviets. The Soviet Union does somewhat collapse by the 1980s, though without the arms race and invasion of Afghanistan that bankrupted them in our timeline, the descent is more managed, with the Soviet Union turning into the Union of Eurasian Republics, a looser federation. Okay, what if the opposite outcome happened? Like if everything that could go wrong for the Western Allies does. Here, the Soviets caught on to what the Western Allies were going to pull and were less surprised when the attacks came due to spies in the UK and also just seeing the military buildup with their own eyes. The Allied offensives in Germany are quickly repulsed. The Red Army executes a massive counter-artillery plan from the Oder to the Ore Mountains. Red Air Force fighters surge from Pomeranian airfields the Allies assumed were empty. Allied railheads in Hanover and Kassel are smashed. The Polish underground stays quiet after NKVD roundups decapitate its districts. Soviet tank corps flood the Elbe Valley, while engineers throw pontoon bridges faster than the Allied fighter bombers can cut them. A quarter of Allied fuel forward of the Weser is also lost due to air raids and sabotage. The British line bends in Mecklenburg and Schleswig. Canadian units fight a stubborn retreat toward Hamburg. In the center, U.S. formations abandon Leipzig and fall back on the Thuringian forest to avoid encirclement. Soviet cavalry mechanized groups ride far into Denmark. Trinity succeeds, but Tokyo refuses to surrender, and shrugs off the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the Soviets renew their non-aggression pact with the Japanese, who after all are simply just fighting the American imperialists. Truman's council fears that a nuclear strike on Soviet soil will create mass Allied defections in France and Italy, and that the Red Army will answer by overrunning the Low Countries and Denmark in days, so no nuclear use is authorized in Europe. The situation also further deteriorates, with communist groups in France and Italy calling general strikes that interrupt Allied logistics. By mid-August, using pure communist magic, Stalin wills a Baltic fleet into existence, with a heavy air cover that closes the Danish Straits to Allied warships. Soviet columns force crossings near Minden and Nienburg, isolating British and Canadian corps around Hamburg and Kiel. Not wanting Dunkirk 2.0 Electric Boogaloo, a British emergency cabinet under Clement Attlee sues for a ceasefire to prevent general disaster on German soil. In Brussels, a treaty is signed whereby there is ordered an Allied evacuation east of the Rhine within 30 days. Unified Soviet occupation of Germany pending a single German provisional government. recognition of the Polish provisional government under Lublin control, and temporary Soviet security zones in Denmark and the Low Countries to ensure supply and demobilization. Meanwhile, communist parties with Soviet backing take power in France and Italy through a mix of strikes, intimidation, and caretaker coalitions that never leave. Even the UK is pulled more into the Soviet orbit as Attlee accepts a long-term trade deal with the Soviet bloc to secure coal and grain. Greece and Turkey face synchronized crises. Britain cannot sustain aid, so the Soviets broker a Balkan security treaty that pulls Greece into a left-led coalition and forces Turkey to accept joint oversight of the Straits with Soviet observers. Iran's northern provinces see a Soviet-protected autonomous arrangement that never rolls back and manages to overrun the rest of the country. After a few more atomic bombings, Japan surrenders. However, the hardliners in the military still refuse the surrender order and evacuate to Korea, forming a government in exile. The Soviets decide to formally recognize this Korean government in exile as a legitimate government of Japan and prop it up. You, dear viewer, might ask, why would the Soviets support a minority-run Japanese state oppressing the Korean majority instead of the communist groups in Korea led by Kim Il-sung? Well, the answer is realpolitik, as the Soviets justify this by saying the Korean peasants are kulaks. Plus the fact that I kind of find it interesting and funny, so the Imperial Japan rum state in Korea is going in this scenario. This might come as a shock to the modern-day Tino and Kaiserreich devs watching this video, but weird unexpected shit happens all the time. Like, I'm pretty sure people in this timeline would look at the East and West Berlin divide in our timeline and say, well, that's unrealistic. So, not to sound terminally online, but imagine in 2025, in this timeline, and you open up YouTube to see in your recommendations a video essay by prominent tanky creator saying why America deserved Pearl Harbor, or a TikTok explaining why the grape of Nanjing never happened, and if it did, they deserved it. The Soviets do force the remaining Japanese armies in China to then give up their controlled territory to the Chinese communists, which allows Mao to take over power in China. However, the Chinese would not be as accepting to the Japanese Empire remaining in Korea, which would cause an even earlier Sino-Soviet split. The United States pivots to a Western Hemisphere defense strategy with Canada, a Caribbean ring, and Pacific Island bastions. You could call it a organization of free nations. France and Italy bind themselves to the European People's Security Community, headquartered in Vienna, under Soviet guidance. Soviet success in the space race and nuclear arms race would also be accelerated due to, well, more Western European scientists and research to plunder. A limited test ban is signed, but verification is weaker than in our world, as the Red Bloc refuses intrusive inspections. By the mid-1980s, a reformist wave still reached Moscow, later and softer than in our world. The leadership rolls out a program called Renewal Through Discipline. It legalizes limited worker councils, allows more small cooperatives, and opens a tightly managed continental retail sector. Food improves, apartments modernize, and the appeal of full political liberalization is co-opted by material gains, allowing the Soviets to limp into the modern age. In conclusion, I definitely think an outcome closer to the latter scenario would be much more likely. There's a reason they literally called it Operation Unthinkable, as I don't think the Allies could have withstood the Soviet horde, even with an economical and technological advantage. Anyhow, everyone, thank you for tuning in. This was definitely a different type of video for me, this being a scenario written by me, rather than covering some random Hoi 4 mod lore, which I inevitably will always get some details wrong about. I am still open to doing some Hoi 4 mod lores, but after all, there are only so many that I could cover before running out of content. I wanted to try something different, so let me know what you want to see next in the comments.